Hi, everybody. On this summer Tuesday night in August. Everybody else is out having fun, and you guys want to learn about mental health. That's a good thing. So I got some prepared remarks, and then I'm going to go off the cuff for a minute, but it always starts with welcome. Welcome to Chester City Hall. Good evening. This is our second in a series of what we're calling the Mayor's Lecture Series. I wanted to start hosting a lecture series here in City Hall to hear from experts and to have you hear from experts on relevant topics to increase our learning and get an informed dialogue going. In the next hour or so, we'll hear a lecture and then have time for questions and answers. Trauma, mental health, and gun violence, something our community experiences on an everyday basis. Is it always addressed? No. I was driving here literally on 9th Street, 9th and Curlin, with the window down and the music maybe a little louder than it should have been, but I hear my name, Mayor, Mayor, Mayor. I look over at a guy in the car next to me, and he just put his arms up and he says, "What are you going to do about the violence?" You know, I don't have an answer for that, but at least it hammers the point home. People are tired of the violence. The violence creates trauma. The trauma creates a change in the brain that could be forever. And that's where mental health services come in. Tonight's topic is a serious one: trauma, mental health, and gun violence. We know that unfortunately so many people of all ages in our city are affected directly or indirectly by gun violence. Dealing with that trauma and mental health in our community is hugely important, so I wanted the second lecture to focus on that. Now, this isn't all about attendance. We are recording this, so this will be a recorded lecture series, something that we can always refer to and show numerous times to the audiences that we need to show it to. We were originally planning to have two presenters tonight because there are a number of organizations, companies, even individuals who are providing this service in the city. LaShira Council, who is the executive director of Chester Community Coalition, they deal directly with trauma and mental health as a result of violence. So I thought it would be a great 1-2 punch to have her join us tonight, but what else is going on in this city and around the country? Say COVID. COVID. So yeah, she called a couple days ago and said she couldn't make it, so we're gonna bring her back and reschedule her sometimes later. But we are lucky to have Dr. Jennifer Toof present tonight, and we'll have a little more time for her. She can just sit here and just have the whole show. Let me tell you a little bit about her. She's a licensed professional counselor and certified trauma therapist who works with clients of all ages through her private practice, Trauma Informed Counseling, LLC. She recently completed her PhD in international psychology and has presented nationally and internationally on topics related to mental health. She's involved in a number of advocacy efforts and is on the board of the Delaware County Suicide Prevention and Awareness Task Force. In parentheses, it says here, and I didn't know this, she's also married to our new Public Works Director, Andrew Heyman. Who would have thought? What a duo, what a power couple you guys are. And there she is, Jolia. So one thing that's different, at least in my opinion, about mental health is that there is a raised awareness a whole lot more than 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago when we were younger. Like, it was like, just work through it. You know, be a man. Don't worry about it. When, I mean, even in our veterans who were coming back from war, you know, it wasn't called trauma. It wasn't called all those four-letter word PTSD and all that stuff. It was just, I had a relative who was in the service that I was really close to, and when somebody started acting a little off, when he found out they were in the armed services, he would say, "Yep, it was the war," you know, and that was his response to it. I can say that young people really kind of, I don't know if they quite embrace it yet, at least around here I'm not seeing it, but young people in general, like you get on podcast or social media, when your reach gets a little further, they seem to be locked in a little more on mental health. You're starting to see, at least I am anyway, more young people understanding that, health is not just physical, but mental. There's a lot of facilities out there now where you don't have to go sit on the couch, or you're not, trying to get with a therapist. You can just sign up and subscribe and do it right face to face on the phone or on your tablet. I'm really looking forward to learning tonight from you. I've been working with a couple groups that want to come to town and do drug and alcohol recovery type work. And the one thing they all tell me is that if you don't have the mental health piece, the drug and alcohol doesn't even factor in. Like, it all stems from mental health. And we're starting to witness a lot more people coming into our town, being dropped off in our town, showing up in our town, who easily, you can just see, are affected by mental health issues. We, as mayor and council, and those of us who see this, it's something new that we have to address. We don't even know what to do now. All we can do is just see it happen, and it's something we want to get ahead of. So what I'm looking forward to tonight is a little guidance from you, a little understanding about what's going on around us, what we can do as a city government to kind of get ahead of this, but more importantly, just get a greater sense of where we are right now in 2024 when it comes to those big topics: trauma, mental health, and gun violence. Without further ado, Dr. Jennifer Toof.
All right, I'm short, so I have to take this out. Thank you so much, Mayor Roots. All right, so you got that on there, so thank you, Justin. All right, so that was a fantastic introduction. You can go to the next slide. I'll just summarize a little bit more. So again, my name's Dr. Jennifer Toof. I'm a therapist, but my specialty is trauma. So that's my expertise, trauma. It's not a rarity. Everyone we see experiences trauma, whether it's here in Chester, whether it's in the suburbs. Trauma is everywhere, unfortunately. Yes, there is increased attention on mental health. I think that is a very good thing. It's a good start. Now it's, what do we do? Where do we go from here? How do we get people the help that we need? And what is that help? All right, so, hi, baby. All right, so you can go next. So my private practice is in Havertown. I do see clients of all ages all over the state of Pennsylvania. And also, I'm an international psychologist, so I work with organizations around the world for consultation on different issues. All right, so why is it important to learn about trauma? So learning about trauma, for one, it helps us make sense of what we or our loved ones are experiencing. It can show us that our reactions aren't a weakness. Right? So many people feel like we're having these physiological responses, we're having these feelings, what's wrong with us? Maybe I'm weak, maybe there's something wrong with me. No. Learning about trauma shows us this is a natural response. Our body is having a natural response to what happened to us, an expected given response. It helps us, it normalizes the experience. It lets you know you're not alone. The people that you care about who have experienced trauma, they're not crazy. This is normal, given what happened to them. Learning about trauma also helps you put a name to the enemy, okay, trauma. And it helps you build the confidence to know the recovery is possible. So with help, trauma symptoms, PTSD, whatever it might be, can be completely eliminated or cured. All right, Justin, you can go to the next one. And this is conversational, so any questions that we have during this, just shoot them out. All right, so what is trauma? Does anyone know? How do we define trauma? What would you say trauma is? Well, let's find out. Go ahead. Abuse of any kinds, yep, absolutely. Some kind of traumatic experience, absolutely. Any other thoughts on how we define trauma? Those are great answers. All right, Justin. So trauma is defined as anything that overwhelms our ability to cope. Okay, it can be a single incident. So that can be one incident, a really traumatic, bad car accident. for example. That might be a single incident. It can be a series of events. So if someone is abused many, many times, that can be trauma, a series of events. Trauma can also be generational, right? So it can be passed down. It can be things that happen to our ancestors. So examples of that on a systemic level, racism, discrimination over years, over generations. It is passed down to us. There's actually really interesting studies in mice. So mice who were exposed to a trauma, not only were their children impacted, but their grandchildren, the grandchildren of these mice had those traumatic responses, and they didn't even know what the original mice had been through. So I think that kind of shows that just even in mice, right? So imagine that in humans. So examples of traumatic events include, but are certainly not limited to, rape, abuse, exposure to death, war, conflict, natural disasters, discrimination, bullying, and more. But a person can experience trauma as a response to any event that they personally find physically or emotionally threatening or harmful. Okay, it's subjective. So two people can be in the exact same situation, only one of them becomes traumatized by it. Also, just because a person experiences a situation, that doesn't mean they'll become traumatized by it. It's complicated. It can be obvious with a very clear cause and symptoms that seem to make sense. This person's traumatized because they went through X. Or it can be buried beneath a lot of symptoms and a lot of things that don't seem very recognizable. As I said, that event that caused the trauma, it could have happened a day ago, a week ago, or half a century in the past. Okay, direct trauma and indirect trauma. Anyone know what I'm referring to when I say that? So trauma can be direct, or it can be indirect. What do you think that means? Absolutely. So Mrs. Root said it can be direct, something that happened to you, or it can be indirect, something that happened to someone else and that you witnessed and still can be traumatizing. So direct, like you said, happens directly to you. Indirect can be it happened to a loved one, happened to someone you know. It can be something you saw on the news. Okay, so thinking about gun violence, for example, seeing gun violence on the news, that maybe didn't happen to you, maybe didn't happen to anyone you know, but it can be very traumatizing to you. And along with that, indirect trauma, before I even get to this slide, so people in the helping profession experience a lot of indirect trauma. So someone like me who's a trauma therapist, and I hear a lot of really horrible stories, I can be indirectly traumatized by that. And that happens to our first responders, that happens to our counselors, that happens to our teachers. Anyone who hears this really horrible stuff, they can be indirectly traumatized. All right, so who's affected by trauma? Everyone. Everyone. There's no boundaries. Any age, any gender, any socioeconomic status, any race, ethnicity, or sexual orientation is affected by trauma. But some people are at greater risk of developing PTSD, which is post-traumatic stress disorder, or any other trauma-related mental illness after experiencing trauma. This stat is about 6 out of every 100 people, so about 6% will have PTSD at some point in their lives. These stats, aren't even 100% accurate because it's underreported, it's undertreated, and it's underrecognized. So I think it's much higher than that. But if we look at this image, so we have a traumatic event, a car accident. So two people might be in that car, one develops PTSD and the other person doesn't. So why could that be? So the person who develops PTSD, they might have an existing mental health condition. So they may have been in that car and they already had anxiety or depression. May have been in that car and they already had a life stressor. So they had recently had a heartbreak, or they've had financial difficulties. Even genetics. So again, with the mice example, so our genetics play a role in whether we develop traumatic symptoms. Lack of support. Big, big risk factor if we don't have people in our lives who are there to support us. Neurological. There's even parts of our brain that wire us to be more at risk for traumatic symptoms. And previous trauma. So if that one person had a lot of pre-existing trauma, they may be at more risk of developing PTSD than the other person. So and that's a reason why it's hard to, we shouldn't judge someone. So if we say this person developed PTSD and I don't understand, I was in the car with them. I don't understand why they're having this reaction and I'm not. We don't know what's going on under the surface. All right, so PTSD, I mentioned that, and we all hear that, right? We've all heard of PTSD. What exactly does that mean? So post-traumatic stress disorder, it's a mental health definition. So if you see a counselor or doctor, they might diagnose you with this. So here's how they would diagnose someone. So it appears in clusters of symptoms. The first cluster is re-experiencing an intrusive symptoms. So that means you're reliving it in some way. It might be nightmares. It might be, flashbacks of the event. It might be any other kind of symptom where you feel like you're back in that moment. Okay, the other cluster is avoidance. You avoid anything that reminds you of it. So if you think of that car, maybe they don't go in the car anymore. Maybe they don't drive. They avoid any memories. They don't want to talk about it. They don't want to feel it. Any person, any place that reminds them, no, shut it off. Arousal and reactivity symptoms. So we see these a lot, right? And sometimes we don't even know that's PTSD, but these are these aggressive symptoms, reckless, self-destructive behavior, self-harm we see in a lot of younger people, sleep disturbance, hypervigilance, that means like constantly being on guard, irritability and anger, and then negative cognitions and mood. So maybe people don't remember aspects of the trauma. Conversely, sometimes you remember every single detail, okay? So it can go either way. Negative beliefs about yourself, others, or the world. So that might come about in the instance of the car accident. It was my fault. It was my fault. I'm a bad driver. Could be the other person, that person. It was all their fault. I can't trust anyone else to drive me anywhere. Or it could be the world. The world's scary. The whole world is scary. I can't trust anyone when I get behind the wheel of a car. So that persistent, distorted blame of yourself or others. Diminished interest in significant activities. The people with PTSD, they don't want to do the things they used to like to do. They might feel detached from others, and they might not be able to experience positive emotions. So they might do those things they used to like to do, but it's just not the same. They just don't get that pleasure. Okay. And so this graphic kind of shows all those symptoms again. PTSD, so the avoidance, the negative thoughts and feelings, and the avoidance. Something else that you might see on here is substance abuse. So that goes along with that reckless behavior. A lot of people with trauma turn to substances to either numb that or forget about it, right? All right, there's even more symptoms that occur in people who have PTSD, panic attacks. Okay, we all know what panic attacks are. We've all probably had a panic attack. People with PTSD have these. It's a type of fear response. It's an exaggeration of your body's response to danger, stress, or excitement. It puts us in this exaggerated sense of, I'm in danger, I don't know what to do, fight, flight, freeze. Dissociation. So I see this a lot with my clients, and it's not as talked about as I think it should be. Dissociation is a way that your mind kind of copes with these overwhelming stress by feeling spaced out. We kind of just escape to another world. We detach from our body. The world around you might not seem real. Self-harm. Okay, so kind of like I talked about, hurting yourself as a way of trying to cope. Could be a way to feel something, or it could be a way to punish yourself. I work with a lot of teens, and parents are really concerned about self-harm, as they should be, right? But usually with self-harm, it's not about wanting to die. It's about wanting to feel something, and it's a coping technique. They're coping with what they're going through by hurting themselves in some way. Other unhealthy behaviors, substance abuse, disordered eating, gambling, overworking, risky sexual behaviors, compulsive shopping, repression or denial of emotions, and yes, suicidal feelings. So sometimes the experience of the trauma might feel like too much to overcome, and that can trigger suicidal ideation or thoughts of suicide. So I always like to put this information up here about 988. Have you guys heard of 988? Okay, good. Not everyone has. It still needs to be talked about more. So 988 is the National Suicide Awareness number. You can text it, you can call it. It's like 911 in that you will immediately get attention and get help, but it's not going to send a cop. Okay, it's going to send a trained mental health professional, and you don't have to be the person having a crisis to call it. You can call and ask about your child. You can call and ask about, you know, anyone that you love. It's available in a number of languages as well. Okay, so it's not just PTSD. PTSD is the big one that we talk about. But after you have a trauma, there can be other symptoms or other diagnoses. So we talked about substances. So you might develop a substance use disorder, alcoholism, a drug addiction problem from a trauma. You might develop an anxiety disorder from it. You might have no reaction, right? So if you're a person who doesn't have risk factors, you might be fine. You might have normal, quote unquote, reactions. You might develop depression. You might develop another stress disorder. You could also develop an acute stress disorder, which means it's just something that lasts for a short period of time. All of these are normal. All of these are common, okay? So it's just about knowing what happens or what can happen after a traumatic event. Okay, trauma impacts us in so many ways. Our mental health, like we talked about, the way you think about yourself, the way you think about other people, the way you think about the world, your ability to remember or concentrate. It really does. I could talk for an hour about how it causes changes in our brain, right? So it really affects, you know, literally parts of our brain that impact how we remember, how we concentrate. It also affects our physical health. Okay, in a lot of ways, the way your body physically reacts, your vulnerability to physical illnesses. There's a lot of research that people who have been exposed to trauma, higher blood pressure, more vulnerable to different sicknesses and diseases. Our emotional health, so just our day-to-day feelings, our social well-being, the way that we act in our relationships with friends, family, partners, even strangers, our ability to make and maintain social relationships, our spiritual well-being. So this is a big one too. So after a trauma, our relationship with God might be changed a lot. Okay, so we might not believe in God anymore. We might not know where to go. We might not think their life has a meaning anymore. We might not think, you know, we have a purpose. We might ask ourselves, why did God do this to us? So it really can change our relationship with the higher power. And just our general functioning, right? So our ability to care for ourselves, our ability to hold down a job, our ability to enjoy our leisure time, things like that. Before we go to the next slide, what else do you think? How else can trauma impact us? Think about yourselves or people you might know. Anything not mentioned? Yeah, just day-to-day activities. Work, Yeah, our ability to, you know, even just go to work. You know, work could be a trigger, or we might not be able to even have that energy to get up in the morning and go to work. Absolutely. All right, so let's talk about gun violence. So every day, Americans are killed by gun violence, and many Americans report that they or someone they care about has experienced gun violence. You might be struggling to understand why this is happening. You might be dealing with the aftermath of a shooting incident in your own life. We have a quote, I think, the next little, if you press. Yeah, so this is a quote from a gun violence survivor who said, "We just learn how to cope. Trauma never goes anywhere. Healing is an ongoing process, a lifelong process." So that was a quote from a gun violence survivor that I felt was particularly poignant. You know, like I said, trauma healing is possible, absolutely, but it's ongoing. It might be a lifelong journey. Okay, so gun violence, it extends far beyond just the person who's been killed or wounded. You might identify, or a person might identify as a survivor if they've witnessed gun violence, if they've experienced intimate partner violence with a firearm, if they've been threatened with a gun, or if they've had a loved one who's been shot or wounded or killed, including suicide by gun. So I think sometimes we don't think about suicide by gun as gun violence, but that's absolutely gun violence as well. When we think about gun violence as a public health epidemic, we often think about the numbers. So I don't know about the numbers in Chester. I think they're going down, right? I think they have been going down, which is awesome. But we also need to think about, more than just the number, or so what's going on, what are the, the lasting impacts, what's the mental health impacts on people, and how are the communities and the people coping with that? This can't be gained just through numbers alone. And this is another quote from the parent of a daughter who died by gun homicide. She said, "I was dancing around the edge of a black hole, trying to avoid sucking me into the black hole where I'd be gone forever." Okay, so gun violence, it's not just the individual, it's a whole community, okay? So, and especially in communities that are ravaged by gun violence, a loss of community can be felt. The networks, the structures in your environment, they just erode, right? It can be that it's normalized, that we become desensitized to it. So we hear another shooting and we just kind of become numb to it. So another quote, a survivor whose brother died by gun homicide stated that people in a neighborhood with gun violence just chalk it up as like another incidence of violence that happens in the community, right? So they feel numb. The realities, the policymakers, the media, they stop caring in a lot of senses. They aren't invested. They stop paying attention to the realities. So as a result, people might just ignore it. They avoid talking about it, and that leads to fewer chances of solidarity to create safer communities and fewer outlets to rebuild trust. Okay, community trauma. So trauma and gun violence it's complicated by a lot of factors in communities. So community trauma relates to the sum of the trauma that we experience as individuals, but also the collective trauma that our entire community experiences when you live in a place with elevated levels of violence. And there's a disproportionate impact on communities of color. Right, so communities of color bear a disproportionate burden of gun violence, and they struggle to cope for a variety of reasons. Okay, structural violence, under or disinvestment in healthcare, or the education system, social and protective services and housing, historical violence like we talked about, legacy of slavery, predatory housing practices and banking practices. All of these complicate the issue, make it harder to get help, make it harder to talk about it, make it harder to get attention from those in charge. So recovery, like I said, from trauma, it's possible. Symptoms can be reduced or even eliminated, but it can be a painful journey, and it may take time. Okay, so if you've experienced the trauma of gun violence, you'll probably never forget it. Okay, survivors often suffer from long-term effects, but there are things you can do to become less distressed and be better able to cope. So we'll spend the rest of the time talking about some of those things. Okay, so the first thing you can do, talk about it. Okay, talking with people you care about, family, friends, community, church, about how you're feeling, what you're thinking, that can help a lot. Okay, many survivors find it helpful to talk with others who have had similar experiences because then you kind of feel that sense of community, but talking about it with anyone. You might also not feel like talking sometimes, and that's okay too. So take your time. When you're ready, find someone who will support you. And talking in general about your feelings is just very, very helpful. So sometimes on presentations, I give a minute here to allow someone to just send a text to someone you care about, someone you love, and just say, "Hi, I'm thinking of you." So, I won't force you guys to do that now, but if you want, just send someone a text and say, "I care about you." Can go a long way. All right, so another way that you can care for yourself is to practice self-care. Self-care is a bit of a buzzword. Do we know what that means? Taking care of yourself, right, yeah. Self-care is anything you do to make yourself feel good. There can be healthy forms of self-care. There can be unhealthy forms of self-care. A healthy form of self-care could be going for a run. And the unhealthy form of self-care could be having a beer. It's different ways. Some might be more healthy than others, but it's something you do to take care of yourself, something you enjoy doing. It's not one size fits all. I'm not a runner, right? So for some people, taking a mile run might be their self-care. That would be torture for me. Not a runner, not one size fits all. But I like to conceptualize self-care in 4 different dimensions. So physical is taking care of your physical body, sleeping, eating, exercise, wearing things you like to wear, taking care of yourself, you know, face routine, makeup, things like that. This graphic gives the example of yoga, rest, stretching, walking, things like that. So if you can take a moment and just think to yourself, how would you grade yourself, A, B, C, D, F, in your current physical self-care? How are you taking care of yourself physically right now? And anyone who wants to share is brave enough to share. Yeah. Just for you. How would you grade yourself? Okay, yeah. Okay, see, that's honest, yeah. C plus. And then there's emotional self-care. So emotional is talking about your feelings to people, managing your stress. It could be journaling. It could be practicing forgiveness, compassion, kindness, anything to do with your feelings. So take a moment again to think about how your emotional self-care is and how you might grade yourself emotional self-care. Because, you know, you could have an A in physical self-care, you're working out every day, you're eating right, but you're not taking care of your emotions. Did I see a hand go up? You want to bet? You're an A for that? Okay, yeah. So we'll jump to spiritual. So absolutely, another form of self-care is spiritual. And that can be religious or not religious. It can be prayer, it can be church, it can be just time alone, meditation, time in nature. Journaling, connection, yoga. So again, take a moment to think how you might grade yourself on spiritual self-care. A, B, C, D, F. You're an A plus maybe. And then social self-care. So think about how you are taking care of yourself when it comes to your relationships with other people. Have you been talking to other people? Are they positive relationships, right? So sometimes we engage in, this can be harder. So this can also include setting boundaries, having support systems in place that are good. This can also really include social media in a positive way, right? We're all on social media. That can be really negative in some ways. It can be positive in other ways. But what's your relationship like with social media and with social connections in general? Take a moment, grade yourself, A, B, C, D, F. How you doing with your social? Yeah, absolutely. All right, awesome. All right, so and then just maybe take a moment to think if there's any of these areas, physical, emotional, social, or spiritual, that you might need to work on. Okay, so if you're a C or lower, you know, how might you be able to improve your self-care in that area? Or if there's someone you're thinking about who might be, you know, struggling in a certain area, what is something you might suggest for them? All right. So another way you can take care of yourself when you're dealing with trauma or really any kind of mental health issue, limit television, radio, and social media. This is particularly helpful when you're dealing with trauma caused from gun violence, because hearing about these shootings every day in the news, it takes a toll on you. It's re-experiencing it, right? So if that is something that you're struggling with hearing about over and over and over, you're just bombarded with it. So if you're able to take a break, you know, block certain people, block certain sites on social media, just not watch the news sometimes, that can be really helpful. The constant flow of images, details of shootings can make those trauma symptoms recur. Instead, find other activities to do that bring you comfort, spending time with family and friends, or doing an activity that brings you joy. Okay, and another really great way to heal from trauma, especially a trauma like gun violence, is to get involved. Do some sort of activity that makes you feel connected and makes you feel like you're helping in some way. So after a tragedy like gun violence, many people feel called to action, right, to prevent this from happening to other people that they care about. Participation in advocacy for policy changes and gun violence prevention presented survivors in a survey with these new possibilities to change things. And they cultivated new interests and new perspectives. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a gun violence charity or organization, but if there's anything, any kind of advocacy or movement that someone wants to get involved with, that can really bring that purpose. That can help with that spiritual calling of, I don't know where to go from here. That can bring that purpose back to someone's life. Okay, so when to seek professional help. So you or someone you love might ask yourselves the following questions. Are my symptoms continuing for a long time? It makes sense in the aftermath, after a really traumatic event, to feel all the symptoms we talked about before, feeling negative, feeling like you don't want to do anything, avoiding things. If these symptoms are continuing for a long time, that might be a sign to seek professional help. If your symptoms are interfering with your everyday life, if you can't go to work, if you can't enjoy spending time with your friends, if you can't go to school, that might be another sign that you might need to seek professional help. If your symptoms are getting worse, that's another big sign that it might be time to seek professional help. There's a lot of therapists out there. It doesn't have to be me. There's so many out there. We all, want to help. We all can help. Find someone who understands trauma and can help you process your event and decrease the effects that it's having on you. Okay, so let's have a conversation. What questions do you have? What's going on? Any thoughts? Councilwoman West. Yeah, absolutely. So there's a stigma, especially with African American men, but in a lot of cultures, that we don't talk about this, right? We don't get help. It's not okay to talk about it. So that's a big barrier to getting help. So I guess that's a question for all of you. How do we encourage people, in the community, and in this case, specifically African American men, to get help? What do we say? Is it something that our family and friends can do? Is it something professionals can do? Is it something the community can do, the church can do? How do we get people to talk about their feelings more? Yeah, that's what I see a lot too. Like the church can be a big influencing factor. What other thoughts? How do we break that stigma? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So do we have that in Chester? Are there churches that have men's groups? Do we? Yeah, okay. 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 He's there. Yep. Mhm. 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 Yeah. Right. Yeah. I mean, and counselors, we are bound by a code of ethics and the law, right? Not to repeat what you say, but that still can be really scary. I don't get a lot of calls from, men saying, I want to tell you, everything that's going on with me. They would rather tell it to their friends or the people they trust already or the church, So I think that you're absolutely right. We need to build that with the community, with the environments that they're already a part of and the people that they trust, like a church environment. Right. Yeah. Yeah. And again, if the trauma may have made them not believe in God or may take them away from those feelings, so it's complicated. But some of those tips I suggested earlier, they don't have to come from a therapist. It can be just sharing, here are some ways, talk to someone, reach out to someone, increase your support system.
I think in a community, particularly with black men, they haven't gone through therapy, and more have, then they could go to their fellow friends and associates and say, try this.
It's not that bad. Yeah.
It worked for me.
Yeah.
We just
Yeah.
don't have enough examples amongst our own
Yeah.
communities, especially among the older
Yeah.
folks. Now, younger folks, that's what I'm saying.
It's getting better. It is getting better. People are talking about it more. Yeah.
They're
Yeah.
almost, I think in some cases, hiding behind the fact that they understand they have mental
Yeah.
issues, and they're, as you're younger, you're directed to help, whereas when you're older, you have to be self-directed or
Right.
push and pull. And if there were more examples of fellows out here who have had success in therapy, we would be examples to others.
Yeah. So if
But I
we
can
can
give you
have
a perfect
people.
example. Like several years ago, one of the artists on the lockdown here, Devin Walls, who had a traumatizing young life, in the life, as we would say. Finally got to the point where he went through therapy. He found a therapist that he could relate to. It was a black woman out of Wilmington, and he felt healed. And he felt healed enough to do a session live right there in the theater. And it was maybe 50, 75 people in the theater not knowing what you're coming for. Is this a play? Is this a show? No, it was set up as such in a black box theater, but there was a real therapy session.
Wow.
And he was bearing his soul. It was a real session. And he emoted and cried and just went back to like that part of him that he would rather forget. And he had his mother there and his family there and all this. The whole place is in tears. We need more example. I mean, that's an extreme example.
That's tough to do for anyone to cry in front of an audience. Yeah.
But
Right. Yeah.
that was strong.
Right.
That was,
Yeah.
it was magical in some senses.
Yeah.
Because you saw, how deep a therapist could get into a man's, psyche. Maybe he wasn't totally healed yet, and maybe he was still dealing with something. But to hear the exchange between the two was live,
Yeah.
right in front of you,
Right.
was
Yeah.
amazing.
And therapy is different for everyone. You know, it doesn't have to be sitting on a couch and spilling out your guts crying. It can be talking to someone more like a friend. You know, it's really different. You have to find the right fit. There's so many different kinds of therapy and so many different therapists. You know, so I would say to anyone, if one person you've seen, you're like, tried therapy, didn't like that person, that does not mean therapy's not for you. It just means maybe that person wasn't right for you or the time wasn't right for you. What was I going to say about something you addressed earlier? Yeah, but the barriers, right? So there's so many barriers to getting care. So even if people wanted to get treatment, there's a lot of barriers out there. So insurance might not covering it, or the lack of providers. There's a severe mental health provider shortage out there, and there's a lot of reasons why. I actually hear from kids that more kids, like Mayor Root said, they want therapy. That's great. More kids these days want therapy. The problem is they're not able to get it when they want it. So either their insurance doesn't cover it or there isn't anyone around. So we do need a lot of systemic changes to make sure that therapy is more accessible for people, especially in areas that have, already a lot of barriers. What other thoughts or questions do we? Yeah. Mm. Absolutely. Oh, that's such a good question. I mean, so he asked if the rise of social media is directly or indirectly related to trauma. I mean, there's a lot of studies out there, so I don't have like 100% yes, but I think that yes. It is, yeah, it is absolutely indirectly. So we see things on social media, for one, that can be traumatic for us. When we see, so relating to gun violence. So when we see, these big cases, these national cases on social media, repeated over and over, we see someone dying. We can see that video. That can be traumatic, especially if it's someone that looks like us, or a child or something like that. Online bullying, all these social media can be really detrimental for a lot of reasons, especially for our youth. We compare ourselves to people on social media, right? I mean, we all tend to, me included, post the highlights of our lives on social media. We don't post the sad things. We don't post the struggles we're going through. We post I did this, I did that. And if you're just scrolling through and seeing, all your friends doing these wonderful things and you're feeling kind of crummy, that can make you feel. Yeah. Yeah. And that would tell me that she was maybe getting some bullying or just some really negative comments. And when you're in the public eye especially, right? All the things that people are saying about her, and she's an Olympic gymnast, Yeah. Yeah, Justin. 100%. There's a lot of research into mentorship and recreational activities for kids, especially, that can help them cope with this. Like they said, like you said, they can maybe talk to that person if they want to share their feelings. But just it incorporates that, maybe physical self-care if they're playing basketball with someone, if it's a church activity, it's a spiritual self-care, But that really is super beneficial. And you also mentioned the complicated nature of it's not always just gun violence. It's usually not just gun violence. It's gun violence on top of things. So I talked about different types of trauma, but there's also something called complex PTSD. I don't know if anyone's ever heard of that, like CPTSD. So that's when you don't just have PTSD from one thing that happened. It's from a lot of things. So it might be, you grew up in poverty, you were abused, you saw gun violence, you were raped, a lot of things compounding. It's not just one incident. And unfortunately, that is the reality for a lot of people. It's not just one incident. It's a lot of complex incidents all on top of one another. They happen they do happen everywhere. It doesn't discriminate, It's just harder in certain areas to get that help, More barriers to getting the help. Absolutely. It's a cycle. It is a cycle of violence. It's not just gun violence. It's sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse. It gets passed on, and it's a cycle. And sometimes without even knowing it, people pass it on, right? So, but I think, like Justin said, like that mentorship can be good, not just to help someone who was traumatized, but maybe to prevent that, to, put a stop to that cycle, seeing someone who is a good influence, so maybe think about how we ourselves can be that good influence, or, how we can make sure a young person receives that good influence in their lives. I would love that, yeah.
Because it means a lot, and I know that God has me to do it. Remember, God sees the heart. Young people, stop the violence. Did something happen in your past? We could relate. So take off the mask and tell us your past. Did your mother or your father or someone else didn't tell you how much you were loved? Please let us give you a hug. Or was it the abuse that we use for excuse? Do you know? We know you can't like or love someone else if you don't like or love yourself. It's not your fault if you were not taught to love yourself within. God knows the pain you have gained. Do you know? God is love, and all that lives in God and God in them. So let them in. And guess what? Now you're not condemned because Jesus has taken our place and became our grace. God loves you. Ask me how I know? Because the Bible tells me so. God loves the sinner, but not the sin. So let them in. And then I will tell part of my story. And what, things that went on in my life. That to be able to meet the person where they at so they can receive the help that they need.
Oh, we had a special appearance from my wife, Marcy. Jennifer, Dr. Toof. That was amazing. I've known her for a couple years. I didn't know she had all this in her. Let me tell you what I loved about what I experienced today from you. It was such a comprehensive lesson. It's like we all know a piece of trauma and healing, and people have been through it. We've had our own. But you took us from A to Z. And it reminded me of a couple things. One of them just makes me laugh, so I got to share it. I think it was my first experience with trauma that I remember. I think I was probably 3 or 4 years old. It was right behind us here, right under that train trestle. And it was when downtown was bustling, right? And I'm holding my dad's hand, and we come under the train bridge, and I hear this noise that was loud. It was something I had never experienced in my life. I was frightened. And I'm looking at my dad, and he wasn't frightened. And I'm looking at everybody else, and they weren't frightened. And I'm like, okay, I'm the only one that's frightened here. I'm going to be cool. But I got to figure this out really quick, because this is scary. And it was nothing more than a train going over. So when I'm sitting down there at Taco Duo, sitting under the train trestle now, trauma has long memory, all right? When a train goes over, I don't get scared anymore, but I remember that moment with Dad. Every time I remember, like I said, holding his hand like that. Another piece that you talked about was how trauma affects mental health. And I'm just talking about me right now. I'm just sharing me. I got off of work. I went to Just Pizza, put in my order. I knew it would take 20 minutes. This was back in the days when I had my newspaper. I was getting the ad from a local business. I receive a phone call. A very close, special friend died. That's the news I got. I darn near collapsed. My knees buckled. Thank God for the door that held me up. I went over to my parents' house to share the news with them. There was sorrow. But what I soon realized was, as you expressed here, mentally, I had immediate memory loss. I forgot all about that pizza. I went home and I'm sobbing and I was like, oh, wait a minute. I ordered a pizza, oh my God, 2 hours ago. They're probably wondering where I am. Thinking that was just a momentary lapse of memory, I went, got my pizza, brought it home and ate it. The next morning I had to go to work. I was working at Sunoco in the refinery, and that's no place to go when your memory is messed up. Okay, really dangerous job. I knew my memory was messed up in the locker room getting dressed. I took for granted that I put on steel toes and fire retardant and hard hat and ear protection and safety glasses and have a wrench and a flashlight and a mat. There's like 30 things I probably have to put together, which I never thought of before. And that particular day, I left the locker room and I went right to my first assignment, and I didn't have like 4 or 5 of those things. And I was like, oh my God, it's a memory thing. So to your point, when do you seek help? Well, I knew I was in danger. I knew I had to take off. I was a little afraid to tell the boss, like, I need a couple days. Why? Because I lost my memory? I mean, that's not a comfortable thing to say, right? But I did take those days off. And because I had a good job with good medical benefits, I said, I'm going to take advantage for the first time therapy. I think therapy might be able to help me. And I found someone right in media very quickly, sat down, told her the situation, and the first thing out of her mouth was, well, that's normal, yeah. Trauma affects people in different ways, and memory loss is pretty common. That virtually healed me right there, just to know that what I was experiencing was common, because I was traumatized by the fact that I thought I was going to have memory loss for the rest of my life. I literally snapped, and what snapped was my memory. And once she gave me the comfort of knowing that what I was going through was normal, it practically healed me right there. I think I went once or twice after that, and I was like, hey, I'm cool. And after that. The third story I want to talk about does relate back to the newspaper I had when I reissued. It was called Chester Matters. And I have a sister who's gone through years of anxiety, depression, and those type of issues. But she's very funny, she's very fun, she laughs at herself, but she can also share what she goes through in a way that very few people can. So I said, hey, can you start writing about your experiences? And I'll put them in the paper. It didn't take long for her to be the favorite feature every month. Like, in that month where she wouldn't provide something, people were hollering at me, where's that Bronwyn piece on mental health? And it showed me and it told me that there's a lot of people who experience that, who want to get some type of coping mechanisms. And she was really fun. She talked about everything from how difficult it was to get care and good care in a way that was digestible, in a way that people who were going through the same thing were saying, I'm going through the same thing. She was living in Seattle where she said the drugs were plentiful. She can get whatever she wanted. She moved to Georgia, it became a lot more difficult through her same insurance for her to get medicines. So she shared stories like that. And the people reacted in a really positive way. They loved hearing from Bronwyn. So what we're talking about today is super important. I'm glad you guys came to hear it firsthand. I'm sure there's going to be many, many more who will pick up this, and we're going to certainly promote the video. This won't be the last time that we talk about these issues. Like I said, I know there's some new organizations, some new groups that want to come to Chester because we know that the help is needed. I'm so glad Nick is here because in a kind of way he represents MVP Recovery. And those guys have been in Chester for a really long time. And they provide services for people in and out of Chester in these very, alcohol, opioids. But again, what I'm learning in this space is that it all stems that if you don't fix the mental, all the other stuff isn't going to last. Oh yeah, that's the group we were talking about. Yeah, me and who? MVP? Okay, great. Yeah, well, this is going to be a repeat. This mental health, drug and alcohol abuse, this is going to be a regular topic. But continue to check with us. We're looking to do this at least once a month. It could be more. We already have a lineup of like 10 different topics to discuss. If you guys have any subject matter experts that you want to include in this space, please let us know. There's, it's an open forum. But I'm really excited that you came, that you guys came. Is it okay if we keep this going? All right, real good. Here.
I don't need the microphone. But I was going to ask you if we could have the doctor back and maybe have like a larger forum where we have, maybe do a women's group, not to kick you guys to the curve, but, a lot of women are going through trauma dealing with being single parents and separation and divorce, it's a lot of issues that we face. And then maybe there's a group you could do for the men, but I would like to have you back. I just want to put my bid in.
Well, at $350 an hour, I don't know if we can afford her. But that's a really good point, and it wouldn't be a part of a lecture series, but we did just hire a new public health person who's really focusing on the determinants of health. And mental health is really on the top of the scale of things that she'll be addressing. So we can run that through Dr. Kristen Motley and have, like you said, targeted sessions that could, again, open the eyes, very much like Devin did for us, that night, particularly for men, where he just exposed himself right there on stage, had a session. I wouldn't recommend that everybody could do that. That took a lot of bravery. But to introduce some of these topics with a targeted group makes a lot of sense. So thanks for that suggestion. Who else got a suggestion? This dude deals with boxers. So when we talk about violence, I mean, that is a violent sport. You haven't said anything, but I'm just curious about the guys that you've been experiencing for most of your life, like in the ring. What do you do to support them? How are they coping? Are they open to this type of, does it affect them?
Usually a lot of fighters, me, I'm an undefeated fighter. I was 9-0. But boxing was my therapy, actually, because, my mom was a quadriplegic in a wheelchair, lived with 3 different families growing up, so it was like all over the place. So that made me, like, that was my way out. Like, my career, celebrity boxing, until 5 years ago, wasn't a business. Now it's a real national business, And before it was therapy, because I was able to do what made me happy. And just, I wasn't worried about the money. It wasn't about the money. It was the passion. Even right now, the money's coming, but it's more passion. But Jennifer, I've known her for a while, and I'm very impressed with what you put out there. That was really awesome. And I think if you let more people know that, I think people have to have the confidence just to want to come here and listen and be like, want to get the help, Because a guy like me, to be honest with you, it woke me up today, and I had a question about my son, because I was always like, that's my man, he's always quiet. I'm like, but he works out every single day, like he doesn't stop. And I'm like, is he getting his frustrations or depression or something out of that? Like, it's worried me. And that made me want to do that. And also it opened up for me thinking this and hearing everybody else that, yeah, I'm not afraid to get help. But how would someone go about, like, you say, how do I know I need help? Like, I don't know if I need help. I'm successful, I'm doing well, but how would I know I need help? What would I need help in? Like, how would I know what I'm suffering from? Oh.
Yeah, and I mean, it's so great to see you after decades, right? But yeah, I mean, and that's some of these mental health issues can be like the silent killer, because we're high functioning, and we don't see underneath that we're struggling from these issues. So, asking yourself or thinking about a loved one, is it impacting your functioning, in some way? And you might say, well, no, I have a thriving career. Okay, so look beyond that. Is it impacting social relationships? Is it impacting, your physical health, your sleep, your eating? But when symptoms are impacting you in a negative way, that might mean it's time to talk to someone. But I think that if you are having those questions at all, reach out to someone. You can talk to a therapist even if you don't have a diagnosis. A therapist isn't going to say, yeah, you're fine, get out of here. We'll talk to you either way. Yeah.
Anybody else want to make any comments or questions, or do we just say good night now? We'll just say good night. Is the oldies party still going on across the street? I think so. If you go outside and hear a thumping, disco beat or oldies beat, head on across to Ethel Waters Park. There's Tuesday night oldies, and it's always fun. Always fun. So thank you guys for coming out on this summer eve. You could have been doing anything anywhere else. To think that you would spend some time with us is really impressive. But we're going to keep this thing going. We're not going to stop this. It's all about education. It's all about community. And I think you hit community right on the head. Like, you got to be deliberate. You got to want community to be community, and this is an effort in that direction. So thank you guys. Thank you, Justin, for being our technical guy, making everything work up here. I don't know what button to push. I don't even know how this mic works, except that I'm going to push this button when I say good night. Good night.